A Narrow Fellow in the Grass is a poem full of riddles, contradictions, paradoxes, and shifts of perspective. It is one of the more ambiguous poems from the prescribed list, which means that you'll need to consider multiple layers of meaning and perspectives. The poem centers on the experience of meeting a narrow fellow in the grass, who appears, disappears, and shifts form throughout the poem. From the accumulation of images, the spotted shaft, the unbraiding whiplash, this extended metaphor assumes the figure of a snake. However, the ambiguity is deliberate here. Despite many close encounters with the narrow fellow, it remains elusive and distant from the persona. There is a sense that although you may have met this narrow fellow, you can never truly understand or know it. This idea is emphasized by the several shifts in tone and perspectives. In your initial reading, you should take note of the changes in point of view and tone as the snake approaches and moves away from the persona. When the snake is distant, the tone of the poem is jovial and contemplative. However, when the snake draws too close, the tension in the emotion is heightened, and we can see this in the contrast between the first and the second stanzas. This moving towards and moving away from the snake continues throughout the poem. From these 2 points we can make some links to the rubric. Firstly, the way perceptions of the world around us and the connections we form with it can change over time. Secondly, the idea that the experience of not belonging or belonging is not static. It is based on interactions between an individual and the world around them. And importantly, the experience of not belonging may consist of both barriers to belonging and the choice not to belong. Finally, you could look at the idea that an individual may challenge or enrich a community, and you could look at the snake and the way it embodies the possibility of both in this poem. From your reading of Dickinson's other poetry, you may be able to notice familiar ideas here. Dickinson kept her distance from her society. Nonetheless, she was not shut off from the world around her, and through her extensive reading and letter writing, she showed a strong interest in the political and religious issues of her time. Therefore, the paradoxical tension that is created in the poem between wanting to draw close to the narrow fellow and withdrawing away at the moment of contact may be read as a reflection of Emily Dickinson's experience of engaging with the world. It would be wrong to assume that this reclusive nature that Dickinson had meant that she had a negative experience of the world around her. One of Dickinson's close correspondents quotes her as saying, "I find ecstasy in living. The mere sense of living is joy enough." As such, Dickinson's decision to remove herself from certain aspects of society may be seen as a way for her to defend this sense of living which brings her such joy. She avoided any connection, whether to people, communities, or ideologies, that would impinge on her autonomy. Central to her experience of life is her self-reflection and her understanding of her interior self. To Dickinson, the doctrines and literal symbols offered by Calvinism and Transcendentalism condensed complex ideas and emotions, and thus limited one's experience of life. And you can see that in the quote here, "I have no respect for doctrines," which she wrote to her sister in a letter. Because of this, I discourage you from describing the snake as a symbol in this poem, because as a poetic image, it embodies too many shades of meaning to be reduced to any one symbol. You'll notice that the snake is never named as such. As the poem shifts in perspective, the narrow fellow becomes a spotted shaft and a whiplash unbraiding in the sun. These shifts in imagery highlight a number of connotations. We'll run through these briefly and return to these ideas later when we look at the stanzas in detail. The idea of the snake in nature, through the story of the Garden of Eden, connects it to the idea of original sin, the gaining of knowledge, and the loss of innocence. The fact that the snake is immersed in grass and it mysteriously appears and disappears within the grass also links the snake strongly with nature and the natural world. The snake's ability to shed its skin, to be figuratively reborn, links it to ideas of rebirth and fertility, and we see that in particular as the snake is able to transform its form multiple times in the poem. Finally, the image of the whiplash carried strong connotations with the problem of slavery in America during the 19th century, and this was an issue with which Dickinson was strongly concerned, and we see that in some of her letter writing and some of her other poetry. Because the snake embodies all of these ideas and connotations, the transformation of the snake throughout the poem suggests that the snake does not belong in either the natural or the domestic world. Instead, it moves on, restless, from the grass to the boggy acre to the barn floor, and it wrinkles away before any connection can occur. The snake, therefore, may be read as a manifestation of Dickinson's experience in her world. To truly belong in nature, or her New England Calvinistic society, or to the transcendentalist poets and writers, Dickinson would need to transform herself, and through this risk cutting herself off from other potential connections. Her choice to not belong to any of these aspects of her world potentially allowed her to enjoy a fuller experience of the wider world around her. As we move into the close analysis of each stanza, take note of how the language suggests connection and separation and the movement between those two aspects of this poem. The first stanza establishes a connection with the snake through personification and the use of colloquial language in a narrow fellow. The personification of the snake is extended through the use of the image occasionally rides, which works to create a sense of connection with the snake. Dickinson encourages the audience to share in the experience of the poem through the use of the second person pronoun, you, and the rhetorical question, did you not? The rhetorical questioning, in combination with the dash, creates a sense of reflection and suggests that the persona is open to this connection with nature, which is initially established with the reference to the narrow fellow in the grass. The inverted syntax in the final line of the first stanza, his notice sudden is, builds on the sense of surprise that accompanies this fellow's appearance, while emphasizing the sibilance of the S sound, suggesting a sudden movement. This image foreshadows a shift in the poem's tone as the snake draws closer in the second stanza. The simile, the grass divides as with a cone, links the natural and domestic spheres, but the choice of the word divides is interesting here. As I mentioned earlier, the snake is an image of knowledge and original sin, and so is figuratively linked to humanity. The snake, however, is immersed in nature. Thus, a divide is created between the two. By existing in the divide between the natural and human world, the snake never truly connects with either. This tension is furthered as the snake appears and disappears throughout this stanza. The alliteration of spotted shaft is seen creates rhythm and suggests the movement of the snake, which it approaches, closes at your feet, and opens further on. The repetition of "and" adds to the sense of the snake drawing close and moving away from the persona, which continues throughout the poem. The contradiction here is the way it closes and opens, creating a paradox which continues throughout the poem. As the potential for connection with this snake comes close to the persona or the snake then draws away. So the idea is that the closer you get, the further the distance and the divide is created. In the third stanza, a sense of distance is re-established, and with it there is a sense of closeness with the snake again, which is created through the pronoun of he and the fact that the persona can relate to the snake. He likes a boggy acre. The use of the male pronoun he suggests an identity, and he is positioned within human constructs. The boggy acre, which is a field measured empirically in a measurement from man, and a floor too cool for corn. The alliteration of the C sound and the assonance of the O sound in floor too cool for corn creates some soft sounds, and it emphasizes a more light-hearted, friendly tone than we get in the stanza previously. The snake at this distance is harmless, and once again it's intriguing to the persona. Halfway through this stanza, however, there is another shift in perspective. The yet signifies a change in direction, and we have a change in sound, from the soft sibilant C sounds to the harsher plosives of yet when a boy and barefoot. The image of the barefoot boy again raises the tension of the poem as the persona draws close to the physical contact with nature and the snake. This image draws us to a transitional point in the poem, as noon, the turning point of the day, approaches. So noon here is used symbolically as a transitional point. The enjambment across the stanzas builds on this sense of tension and transition. Again, with this transition point, the persona draws closer to the snake. The image of the whiplash suggests the potential harm the snake presents. As I mentioned earlier, the whiplash may be read as a symbol of the slave trade. The slave trade had ultimately led to the Civil War in America between the northern and southern states. This contextual information adds to the sense that this is a transformation point, a moment where America lost its innocence and lost its Puritan image of itself as a new Eden. Even without this reading, however, there is a strong sense of transformation. This highlights the way that the snake must transform when it moves into the domestic world. It becomes inanimate, a whiplash unbraiding in the sun. The semicolon adds to the sense of this transitional point, where the snake transforms from a whiplash and wrinkles and is gone. Once again, as the persona draws close, this proximity paradoxically results in a greater separation. The snake ultimately leaves the domestic sphere and returns to the natural world. And we get that with this strong image of the snake wrinkling away. In the next stanza, another shift in perspective occurs as another group, nature's people, is introduced. The term nature's people is ambiguous and may refer to the snake and other creatures as being the people that make up nature, or it may refer to a group of people who attempt to connect with nature. Whichever reading you choose, it is important to note that the persona does not belong with nature's people. This is made clear through the use of the pronouns I and they. Nonetheless, there is a parallel connection and mutual understanding which is created through the repetition of no and the expression of strong positive emotion in the final two lines. I feel for them a transport of caudality. But again, as the persona draws close to making a connection, a barrier is created through fear. While Dickinson reflects that being frightened by a snake is a fairly common experience, one that is shared with nature's people, the imagery in the final stanza suggests that this image is ultimately isolating. A change in tone is emphasized through the use of high modality language in the line, "but never met this fellow." And in the next line, we learn that the strong emotion that Dickinson describes in this final stanza is created whether the persona is with company or isolated. The alliteration connects these two ideas in attended or alone. In the final two lines, the experience of this fear is described as both a physical and emotional experience. And it's clear at the end that this is quite an isolating experience. This is seen most clearly in the final line, and zero at the bone. This image is similar to the more colloquial phrase, frozen to the bone, and creates a strong sense of fear and isolation. The metaphor of being zero at the bone, in particular, highlights a sense of fragility and suggests the possibility of physical destruction that could be encountered when you meet a snake. In summary, the layers of meaning in this poem mean that the snake is not a symbol of any one thing, and the fear that it creates is not a reaction to any one thing. The experience conveyed in this poem is complex and contains multitudes of impressions and connections. Therefore, simplistic ideas such as Dickinson belongs to nature don't really work. As Professor Murfett suggests, this poem not only makes a case against simplistic notions of nature, but also against simplistic notions of America as a symbolic Eden for the Puritans who emigrated from England. While Dickinson, like the writers of the Romantic period, felt strongly about the beauty and richness of nature, in The Narrow Fellow in the Grass, she complicates this view as she emphasizes the difficulty of nature's people who cannot find a complete connection to either nature nor the people of their society. The Romantics and nature's people do not truly belong to nature or their society. Nonetheless, they are enriched by their proximity to both. This is an idea that is repeated in a number of other poems, where a persona is positioned as parallel to their society. Dickinson in this poem uses the image of the narrow fellow in the grass to illustrate the effect of this tension. The snake is both in nature and immersed in nature, but is also a symbol of knowledge, original sin, and corruption. It contains contradictory ideologies and experiences, just as Dickinson's interior self does.